It's Sunday morning in 1955, and a small church in rural Iowa is packed to the rafters. The congregation sings hymns with voices that shake the wooden beams, and when the pastor stands to deliver his sermon, he speaks of salvation, redemption, and the eternal soul. Politics barely gets a mention, except perhaps in the most abstract terms about living righteously. Fast forward 70 years to today and walk into that same church. The pews might be half empty, but the passion hasn't dimmed. It's just redirected. The sermon now weaves together scripture and Supreme Court decisions, Bible verses and ballot initiatives, the gospel and government policy. The pastor's voice still shakes those beams, but now he's telling his flock exactly who to vote for, which laws to support, and which politicians are doing God's work. What happened? How did American religion transform from a force largely separate from partisan politics into one of its most powerful engines? The answer is far stranger and more calculated than you might think. It involves a fabricated moral panic, a handful of shrewd political operatives, segregated schools, and a tax bill that changed everything. This is the story of how American Christianity didn't just embrace politics, it became politics. Let me take you back even further to understand what we lost. In the early 20th century, American churches existed across a remarkable political spectrum. You had the social gospel movement, where progressive Protestant ministers preached that Christianity demanded economic justice, workers' rights, and care for the poor. These weren't fringe radicals, they were mainstream voices in American Protestantism. Meanwhile, fundamentalist Christians, those who held to strict biblical literalism, actually avoided politics almost entirely. Their theology taught them that the world was fallen and corrupt, that Jesus would soon return, and that involvement in worldly affairs was a distraction from saving souls. In 1965, Jerry Falwell himself, who would later become one of America's most powerful political preachers, gave a sermon titled Ministers and Marchers, where he condemned clergy involvement in civil rights protests. He declared that preachers are not called to be politicians, but to be soul winners. Even the most conservative religious leaders preached separation from political engagement. The idea that evangelical Christianity would one day become nearly synonymous with the Republican Party would have seemed absurd to most observers in the 1950s and 60s. So what changed? Here's where our story takes its first major turn. The commonly told narrative says that evangelical Christians stormed into politics because of Roe v. Wade in 1973, that the legalization of abortion so outraged religious conservatives that they had no choice but to become politically active. It's a clean story, it's emotionally compelling, and it's almost completely false. The real catalyst was far less noble. It was about money and race. In 1970, the IRS, under pressure from civil rights groups and federal court decisions, began enforcing anti-discrimination laws against private institutions, including religious schools. Across the American South, thousands of segregation academies had sprung up in response to Brown versus Board of Education. White parents, unwilling to send their children to integrated public schools, created private Christian schools where segregation could continue. These weren't small operations. By 1974, there were approximately 3,500 of these schools in the South alone, educating hundreds of thousands of white students. The IRS decision meant these schools would lose their tax-exempt status if they continued to discriminate. This hit the evangelical community where it hurt most, in their wallets and their autonomy. Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist institution in South Carolina, became the test case. When the IRS revoked its tax exemption in 1976 due to its ban on interracial dating and marriage, the university fought back. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court in 1983, where Bob Jones University lost 8-1. But by then, the damage was done. Or rather, from the perspective of political operatives, the perfect conditions had been created. Enter Paul Weyrich, a conservative activist and co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. Weyrich had been trying for years to mobilize evangelical Christians into a political force, but abortion wasn't moving the needle. In a 1990 interview, Weyrich admitted that he tried to rally evangelical leaders around abortion after Roe v. Wade, but it fell flat. He said, and I'm quoting here, I was trying to get those people interested in those issues, and I utterly failed. What changed their mind was Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian schools, trying to deny them tax-exempt status on the basis of so-called de facto segregation. Warwick and other conservative strategists realized they had found their issue, but they also knew it was politically toxic to rally religious voters around the defense of segregation. So they performed a masterful sleight of hand. They acknowledged the tax-exempt issue as a starting point, but quickly pivoted to abortion, pornography, and later homosexuality as the public face of their movement. I want you to pause for a moment here and really think about the cynicism of this strategy. These political operatives took a community's anger over losing the ability to run racially discriminated schools and channeled it into a broader culture war, rebranding religious conservatives as defenders of the unborn rather than defenders of segregation. And it worked spectacularly. By the way, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I'm always curious about Professor Archive's global reach. Drop a comment and let me know what profession you have. Are you a teacher, a student, someone just fascinated by how history shapes our present? I'd love to know. In 1979, Warwick, along with televangelist Jerry Falwell and direct mail pioneer Richard Viguerie, founded the Moral Majority. This organization would become the template for modern religious political activism. Falwell, the same man who 15 years earlier had condemned ministers for getting involved in politics, now declared that the idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country. The transformation was complete, not through grassroots conviction, but through top-down organization and strategic messaging. The moral majority's impact was immediate. In the 1980 election, evangelical voters who had largely stayed home or split their votes in previous elections turned out in unprecedented numbers. About two-thirds of white evangelical voters supported Ronald Reagan, a divorced Hollywood actor who rarely attended church. This was remarkable. These voters, who placed such emphasis on personal piety and biblical values, enthusiastically backed a candidate whose personal life didn't reflect their stated values. What mattered wasn't Reagan's personal faith, but his willingness to speak their political language and advance their policy goals. Reagan, ever the skilled communicator, understood the assignment perfectly. In 1980, he addressed a rally of religious conservatives and told them, "I know you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you." It was a brilliant inversion. Reagan positioned himself not as a politician seeking religious validation, but as an ally joining their crusade. The numbers tell an incredible story of transformation. In 1976, evangelical voters were roughly split between Jimmy Carter, himself a born-again Southern Baptist, and Gerald Ford. Just 4 years later, Reagan won them by massive margins. By 1984, Reagan captured an astonishing 78% of the white evangelical vote. A voting bloc that barely existed as a unified political force in the mid-1970s had become one of the most reliable and powerful constituencies in American politics. But here's something most people don't realize. This politicization wasn't embraced by all Christians, or even all evangelicals. There was significant resistance from within the religious community. Christianity Today, the flagship evangelical magazine founded by Billy Graham, initially maintained a more politically diverse stance. Many pastors and theologians warned that too close an embrace of political power would corrupt the church's spiritual mission. They were right, but they were drowned out. The infrastructure of politicized religion was being built too quickly and too effectively. Christian radio stations, which had previously focused on gospel music and biblical teaching, began carrying political programming. Religious television networks like Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network blended faith content with explicit political advocacy. Direct mail campaigns, using church directories and subscription lists from religious publications, reached millions of conservative Christians with alarmist messages about the direction of the country. These weren't just fundraising letters. They were sophisticated psychological operations designed to create a sense of crisis and urgency. The language was apocalyptic. America was at a crossroads. Secular humanists were destroying the nation's Christian foundations. Only immediate political action could save the country from moral collapse. And it required money, lots and lots of money. The financial numbers are staggering. By the mid-1980s, religious broadcasters were raising hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The moral majority alone claimed 6.5 million members at its peak, and a budget of tens of millions of dollars. This money funded not just advocacy, but the creation of a parallel infrastructure, Christian schools, homeschooling networks, legal advocacy organizations, political action committees. The goal was nothing less than the Christianization of American public life. Now, the story takes another crucial turn in the 1990s. The Soviet Union collapsed, removing the clear external enemy that had helped unite religious conservatives and foreign policy hawks. The culture war intensified to fill that vacuum, and a new generation of leaders emerged to wage it. The Christian Coalition, founded by Pat Robertson in 1989 and led by Ralph Reed, perfected the art of grassroots political organizing. Reed, a baby-faced political operative with a doctorate in American history, understood that the moral majority's top-down approach had limitations. The Christian Coalition instead focused on local organizing, getting religiously motivated conservatives elected to school boards, city councils, and state legislatures. Reed's strategy was brilliantly described in his own words. "I want to be invisible. I do guerrilla warfare. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know it's over until you're in a body bag." This wasn't religious revival. This was political combat with a religious veneer. The Christian Coalition's voter guides, distributed in churches on the Sunday before elections, became legendary for their effectiveness and their bias. These guides claimed to be nonpartisan, simply comparing candidates' positions on issues. But the issues selected and the way they were framed made it crystal clear which candidates were acceptable and which were agents of moral decay. By 1994, the Christian Coalition distributed 33 million of these voter guides in the midterm elections that swept Republicans into congressional majorities. Exit polls showed that religious conservatives made up one-third of the electorate that year. The politicization of American religion had reached critical mass. But here's where our narrative gets even more complex, because while religious institutions were becoming more political, Americans themselves were becoming less religious. This might seem contradictory, but it's actually causally related. Studies have shown that the perception of religion as a partisan force has driven millions of Americans, particularly young Americans, away from organized religion entirely. In 1972, only about 5% of Americans said they had no religious affiliation. By 2000, it was 14%. Today, it's over 28%, with the numbers even higher among younger generations. The so-called knowns, people who check none of the above when asked about religious affiliation, are now the fastest-growing religious category in America. Research by political scientists David Campbell and Robert Putnam found that much of this decline is directly attributable to the politicization of religion. Young people who might otherwise be religious see the close association between conservative Christianity and Republican politics and want no part of it. In interviews, many of these religiously unaffiliated Americans say they're not opposed to faith itself, but to the political package deal they perceive religion has become. So we've created a vicious cycle. Religious institutions become more political to maintain influence in a secularizing society. That politicization drives more people, especially moderates and progressives, away from religion. The remaining congregants skew more conservative and more political. The churches become even more partisan, and the cycle accelerates. Let me give you a specific, heartbreaking example of what this looks like on the ground. In 2016, I spoke with a woman I'll call Sarah, not her real name, who had been a devout evangelical Christian her entire life. She attended church 3 times a week, tithed faithfully, and raised her children in the faith. During the 2016 election, her pastor began preaching explicitly about the election from the pulpit, telling the congregation that a true Christian had no choice but to vote for Donald Trump. When Sarah expressed discomfort with this, suggesting that perhaps Christians could have different political views while sharing the same faith, she was ostracized. Small group Bible studies she had attended for years suddenly had no room for her. Friends stopped calling. Eventually, she left the church entirely. Not because she lost her faith, but because her faith community had become indistinguishable from a political action committee. Sarah's story is not unique. It's repeated in thousands of churches across America. The 2016 election crystallized something that had been building for decades. White evangelical Christians supported Donald Trump at higher rates than they had supported George W. Bush, a man who openly discussed his born-again experience and emphasized his personal faith. Trump, by contrast, struggled to name a favorite Bible verse, referred to communion as the little cracker, and had lived a life of serial adultery and obvious materialism. Yet 81% of white evangelicals voted for him. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was the logical conclusion of 40 years of religion as politics. Personal piety had become less important than political outcomes. The pastor's moral character mattered less than his willingness to preach the right politics. Theology took a back seat to ideology. Here's one of the most telling statistics I've encountered. In 2011, only 30% of white evangelicals agreed that a political leader who commits immoral acts in their personal life could still behave ethically in a public role. By 2016, that number had more than doubled to 72%. What changed? Not theology, not biblical interpretation, just political expediency. When your chosen candidate doesn't meet your stated moral standards, you simply adjust those standards. Some religious leaders have recognized the danger and tried to sound the alarm. Russell Moore, who led the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, warned repeatedly that the church was selling its moral authority for political power. For his trouble, Moore faced such intense backlash from within the denomination that he eventually resigned and left the Southern Baptist Convention entirely. His departure was a powerful symbol of how thoroughly politics had captured major segments of American Christianity. Meanwhile, white evangelical Protestantism is in demographic freefall. The average age of white evangelicals is now 56, significantly older than the national median. Young people are leaving in droves. Between 2006 and 2020, the percentage of Americans identifying as white evangelical Protestants fell from 23% to 14%. If current trends continue, this once dominant religious tradition will represent less than 10% of Americans within a generation. The tragedy is that this decline isn't primarily about theology or even faith. It's about politics. Exit interviews with people leaving evangelical churches consistently show that political issues, not doctrinal disagreements, are the primary motivator. They're tired of sermons that sound like Fox News transcripts. They're exhausted by the culture war. They're disillusioned by the obvious hypocrisy of religious leaders who excuse any behavior as long as it comes from their political tribe. And it's not just affecting evangelical Christianity. Mainline Protestant denominations and Catholic churches have their own versions of this story. The Catholic Church in America has seen intense political polarization, particularly around issues of abortion, religious liberty, and social justice. When Pope Francis releases an encyclical emphasizing care for creation and the poor, conservative American Catholics dismiss it. When he speaks about traditional sexual ethics, progressive Catholics tune out. The church has become a choose-your-own-adventure of political validation rather than a unified spiritual community. But let's return to our original question. How did we get here? The answer is a combination of cynical political calculation, genuine religious conviction, cultural anxiety, and structural changes in American society. The political operatives in the late 1970s didn't create religious conservatism. They channeled it, shaped it, and weaponized it. The pastors and believers who followed weren't all dupes or hypocrites. Many genuinely believed and still believe that America's moral character is at stake and that political action is necessary to preserve it. The tragedy is that in gaining political power, religious institutions have lost something far more valuable: their moral authority, their prophetic voice, and their ability to speak truth to power, rather than simply becoming another faction seeking power. If you're finding this fascinating and want to see more deep dives into history that shapes our present, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps Professor Archive continue creating this kind of content. I spend weeks researching each video to bring you these lesser-known stories and connections. Every bit of support matters. There's a profound irony at the heart of this story. The religious right mobilized in the late 1970s partly out of fear that America was becoming too secular. Their solution was to make religion more political, but in doing so, they've accelerated the very secularization they feared. By tying religious identity so closely to partisan politics, they've made religion repellent to anyone who doesn't share those politics. They've created a Christianity that looks less like the gospel accounts of Jesus, who avoided political power and sided with the marginalized, and more like any other interest group fighting for its slice of influence. The data on this is striking. Countries with state religions or close church-state relationships tend to be more secular than countries with stricter separation. When religion becomes synonymous with political power, it loses its transcendent appeal. America is running this experiment in real time. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a story about whether conservative or progressive politics is correct. Reasonable people of faith can and do disagree about policy issues. The problem isn't that religious people have political opinions, it's that political opinions have increasingly become religious tests. That partisan affiliation has become more important than theological conviction. That churches have become, in effect, subsidiary organizations of political parties. Consider this thought experiment. Imagine a person who accepts every major theological tenet of evangelical Christianity. They believe in the divinity of Christ, the resurrection, salvation through faith, biblical authority. But they vote for Democrats. Are they welcome in most evangelical churches? The honest answer, increasingly, is no. Not officially, perhaps, but in practice, the culture of many conservative churches makes political progressives feel unwelcome, judged, and suspect. This represents a fundamental perversion of religious community, where partisan politics trumps shared faith. It would have been unthinkable to the early church, where rich and poor, slave and free, joined together despite vast social differences. It would have been foreign to most of American religious history, where churches contained political diversity united by common belief. The question we're left with is whether this can be reversed. Can American religion disentangle itself from partisan politics? The honest answer is that it's hard to see how. The infrastructure is too entrenched. The financial incentives are too strong. The psychological identification is too deep. For millions of Americans, their political identity and religious identity have fused into a single package. Asking them to separate the two would feel like asking them to deny who they are. But there are glimmers of hope. A growing number of pastors, particularly younger ones, are trying to reclaim a less politicized faith. They're focusing on spiritual formation, community service, and theological depth rather than electoral politics. Some churches have adopted policies banning partisan political speech from the pulpit. Others are creating space for political diversity within their congregations. Acknowledging that faithful Christians can reach different political conclusions, there's also a broader reckoning happening in American Christianity about its relationship to power. The sexual abuse scandals that have rocked multiple denominations, the racial justice protests that forced white Christians to confront their complicity in systemic racism, the pandemic that revealed how many Christians prioritized political tribal markers over care for the vulnerable. All of these have created moments of reflection and, for some, repentance. The story of how politics replaced religion in America's pews is ultimately a story about what we worship. When churches become indistinguishable from political rallies, when pastors sound like pundits, when faith becomes a means to electoral ends, we've revealed what we truly value. And it's not transcendence, grace, or love. It's power, influence, and cultural dominance. The early Christians were known for how they loved one another and cared for the poor and sick, even in a hostile Roman Empire. They changed the world not through political power, but through sacrificial service and radical community. American Christianity in the 21st century risks being known primarily for its political allegiances, its culture war battles, and its proximity to power. That's not a religious revival, it's a political movement wearing religious clothing. As we've traced this history from the segregation academies of the 1970s through the moral majority, the Christian coalition, and into our present moment, one thing becomes clear. This didn't happen by accident. It was orchestrated, funded, and executed by people who understood that religion could be a powerful political tool. But tools get used up. And there's growing evidence that American Christianity is being used up by its political entanglements, losing members, losing moral authority, and losing its prophetic voice. The pews might have politics now, but they're increasingly empty. Perhaps that's the real cost of this transformation. In seeking to save Christian America through political power, the religious right may have hastened its decline. In choosing to be politically relevant, they've risked becoming spiritually irrelevant. In winning elections, they've lost generations. The story isn't over. History is still being written. But the arc we've traced from the calculated political mobilization of the late 1970s to today's deeply polarized religious landscape should give us pause. It should make us ask hard questions about the relationship between faith and power, between spiritual conviction and political expediency, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world. Because somewhere in rural Iowa, that church from our opening still stands. The pews are emptier now, the congregation is older, but every Sunday someone still stands to preach. The question is whether they're preaching a gospel that transcends politics or a politics wrapped in gospel language. The answer matters more than we might think, not just for the future of American religion, but for the soul of the nation itself. Thanks for watching Professor Archive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads.